Hey, and welcome to the highlights of episode number 221 with Brenda Davis. Now, some of my favorite parts of this episode were when she talks about how we can prevent disease through nutrition. I also loved it when she talks about the importance of B12 and when she shares the key things all the centenarians in the world eat. I also loved it when she shares with us how to maximize our iron absorption, how to have a thriving and healthy pregnancy. And I loved it when she gives us all her breastfeeding tips and tricks when you're eating a whole food plant-based diet. But there is so much more wisdom, knowledge, and inspiration that you get in the full episode. So to listen to the full podcast and get all the info in the show notes, head on over to melissaambrosini.com/221 right now. Brenda, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you here. Can you tell us your story and how you got to where you are today doing the work that you now do? Like, how did this all unfold for you?
I was trained as a kind of conventional registered dietitian, went to a very conventional university and, plant-based. It was always something that I thought was intriguing and fascinating. I didn't really know it was possible because I'd never met people who ate plant-based. As I grew up, I lived in sort of hunting and fishing territory. But when I was 29 years old, I was a public health nutritionist. And one of my best friends was on his way hunting. I had been married for about 10 years at that point. And this was actually the best man at our wedding, stopped over on his way deer hunting. And it was essentially what he said to me that changed the course of my life. Because when he showed up to have coffee before going deer hunting, I said to him, I don't understand how you can feel good about going into the bush with a big gun and shooting a beautiful, innocent creature like a deer. And what he said back to me silenced me. He basically said, just because you don't have the guts to pull the trigger does not mean you are not responsible for the trigger being pulled every time you buy a piece of meat camouflaged in cellophane in the grocery store. And then he said, at least the animals I eat have had a life. I wonder if you can say the same for the ones that are sitting on your plate. And I had no response because I knew he was absolutely right. But after he said that to me, I vowed that I would learn more about where the food I was eating was coming from. And it took me all of about a week to decide I didn't want to participate in the system of cruelty that was associated with the animal agriculture industry today. And it was hard because I wasn't sure if I would be ousted from my profession if I went vegetarian. I mean, I'm essentially vegan, to be honest. And it was scary for me, but I decided that I needed to help people who made the same kind of choices that I was making to do it well. And so that became really the thing that grounded me in my career. I wanted passionately to help people who wanted to make choices that were more ecologically sustainable and ethically justifiable to do so in exceptional health.
You probably see a lot of eczema in your practice, but what are some other common things that you see in your practice today?
Well, I'd say the most common are really the diseases of lifestyle that kill 70% of the people in the developed world, and now pretty much globally as well. So I just see a ton of diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, and cancers. So those are the biggies. And of course, all sorts of GI problems, and the list goes on. All of these chronic degenerative diseases that are essentially almost entirely preventable.
Absolutely. There's a lot of focus on cancer, but the number one killer is still cardiovascular disease.
Yes.
But what role does a plant-based diet have in preventing cardiovascular disease?
It's the same components that prevent cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, because essentially the drivers of these diseases are really a combination of inflammation, oxidative stress, especially in the case of diabetes, but also heart disease, lipotoxicity, glycotoxicity, and also dysbiosis, or a very unhealthy gut flora. And so just to define some of these terms, I mean, inflammation is really almost every disease you can think of. We have this low-grade chronic inflammation that is triggered by excessive consumption of unhealthy foods and an unhealthy lifestyle. And what we know about inflammation when we look at the studies is that people who are plant-based have far lower levels of inflammation because they're eating more of the foods that have anti-inflammatory components. It's the same story with oxidative stress. We have dozens of studies showing less oxidative stress in plant-based eaters.
Let's talk about all the centenarians around the world. What do they all have in common when it comes to their diet? Because these are the people that live the longest all around the world, all the blue zones. What do they have in common?
I love studying the blue zones, and I've actually looked at them very, very extensively. But where diet is concerned, there's two common features that run through every single blue zone on the planet. They all eat plant-based diets and they all eat legumes. And that tells us something. If you look at the longevity data, you look at meta-analyses, the one consistent thing you see over and over and over again is that meat is associated with increased risk of death and dying, and legumes are associated with decreased risk of death and dying, and disease as well.
But are you still referring to organic, grass-fed, grass-finished, raised on, their natural diet as well?
Yes, and certainly those products are preferable to products that are raised with added, antibiotics and hormones and all of those things. But regardless, what we know is the carnitine in meat increases TMAO, which is atherogenic. We know that ground meat is, one of the richest sources of endotoxins. No matter where the animals are, grass-fed meat actually has a way higher carbon footprint than intensively raised animals. They all have heme iron, which is, a pro-oxidant. They all contain Nu-5-GC, which is a highly pro-inflammatory molecule. They are very high in saturated fat. They're relatively high in cholesterol. They tend to upregulate cancer-promoting genes. All of these things, which really don't change between, whether it's grass-fed meat or not. We know that animal protein tends to be harder on the kidneys, especially when consumed in large quantities. The agrochemicals, a lot of the persistent organic pollutants simply move up the food chain. So even in grass-fed, organically grown animals, we still see relatively high amounts of some of these compounds, whether it's dioxins or PCBs or whatever. And so regardless, there are problems with consuming meat, and, not to mention the ecological footprint and the whole ethical argument of how these animals are raised and how they're slaughtered. We're talking about 70 billion land animals. That's every year. Then when you think about the carbon footprint involved in that processing of the growing and processing of that number of animals, it's our number one contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to, if we're going to survive on this planet as a species, we've got to be smarter about where our food is coming from.
A lot of people might be thinking, okay, well, if I'm going to replace some of the animal products with plant-based proteins, am I still going to get enough protein?
Yeah. Human beings need about 10 to 15% of their calories to come from protein. And there's almost no whole plant foods that have less than that. The only category is really fruit, which is about 1 to 10% of calories from protein. The only foods that don't have any protein are sugar and pure fat. Everything else, we look at our legumes, they're 20 to 40% of calories from protein. If you eat a variety of plant foods, as most vegans do or most plant-based eaters do, you're going to get about 13 to 15% of calories from protein on average. And so it's just not a huge issue.
And we can't deny that plants have to be a majority of our diet.
Most food guides, half the plate is plants, is actually 3/4 of the plate is plants. Half is fruits and vegetables, a quarter is grains, and then you've got the protein section, which is 1/4, which it would be preferably legumes, because they're the foods that are loaded with fiber and phytochemicals and antioxidants and all of those things that protect us. Just to be really clear on the macros, I think this is really important for people to understand, is your percentages of calories from macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbohydrate, matters far less than the source of those macronutrients. It matters far less how much fat you're getting than it matters that you're getting enough essential fatty acids and that you're getting enough fat to allow for proper absorption of nutrients and phytochemicals. So if you're at 20% or 30%, that doesn't matter as much as the quality of the fat and that you're getting the essential fatty acids that you need.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk about another common question, which is around B12. A lot may argue that if this was a complete diet, we should be able to get B12. Can you talk to that?
What people who are plant-based do need to understand is plants are not reliable sources of B12 because we make sure we're getting rid of pathogenic bacteria in our food. So we make sure it's well sanitized. And in that process, we lose any B12 producing bacteria as well. But that doesn't mean that a plant-based diet is somehow inferior to one that contains foods with B12. Because the first 80% of the Paleolithic period, we were essentially plant-based out of necessity. We didn't know how to catch animals. And yet, when you would pull roots out of the ground or you would drink water, those things would be contaminated with B12 producing bacteria, so you would get enough. The human species has sort of evolved consuming very small amounts of B12. It's tiny. It's 2.4 micrograms is the RDA here in North America. It's a very, very tiny amount, but you need to get it reliably. And so basically the other thing to know is if you're over the age of 50, I'm 60 myself. So anybody over the age of 50 years, you should not rely on B12 from animal products. It's not a reliable source of B12 for you. And the reason is simple. In animal products, B12 is bound to protein. In order to cleave that B12 off of the protein it's bound to, you need to be able to produce enough stomach acid and you need to produce enough enzymes to do that act of cleaving that B12 off. And probably as many as 30% of people over 50 don't do that.
Wow, that's so interesting. I'd never heard that about being over 50 and that's so interesting. I'll be sharing that with my in-laws and my parents. But
Yes.
I take an activated B complex. Would you suggest taking something like that?
I would suggest, so people, they don't have to get anything fancy. They just need to get B12. So I would say, 1,000 micrograms twice a week in a supplement. And the reason, like I said, we need 2.4 micrograms a day. So some people might be thinking, well, why the heck do we need 1,000? And the reason is that if you're taking in any more than about 500 micrograms, you absorb probably less than 1%, maybe 0.5% of what you're consuming. So you really get very little of what you're consuming. And so you need those larger amounts. But if you do it twice a week, 1,000 micrograms, or daily, at least, some people would say 10 micrograms to 25 micrograms. Some experts will say higher, 100 to 250. But if you take a multi with a little bit of B12, you possibly could get enough from that.
How does a plant-based diet help with gut health? Obviously, the diversity of plants that you eat is going to be an indicator of your health because different plants feed and have different bacteria. And Candida and SIBO plague so many people. So what's going on there and how can eating more plants help with our gut health?
Well, I think what people need to understand is that there's what we call probiotics and prebiotics. And probiotics are the bacteria themselves. So you might eat some fermented foods or some sort of yogurts, like even a non-dairy yogurt, some sort of kombucha tea or whatever it is that contain these active microorganisms, which can help populate your gut with more diversity of microbiota. But then there's also the prebiotics, and prebiotics are basically the components in food that feed your bacteria. And you want to feed the good bacteria. And so, where are prebiotics? Well, prebiotics are essentially the fibers that we don't digest and absorb that make it to the large intestine that are food for your bacteria. And so when you eat a diet that's mainly meat and dairy, or, that's got a lot of processed foods and meat and dairy, for example, you're not feeding your gut bacteria. There's hardly any prebiotics there.
So what about iron? What about, iron? Because that's another thing that a lot of people question.
Yeah.
Will I become iron deficient?
The people that eat the most iron are vegans.
Wow.
They eat more iron than omnivores. So the numbers will be, 22 milligrams for the vegans, 20 or 18 to 20 for the meat eaters, and, so on. And so they consistently have the highest intakes of iron. The issue is that the iron from plants is not as absorbable as the iron from meat, but we need to maximize the absorption of that iron. Yeah, so what we want to do that is, number one, we want to make sure we're getting enough iron, which means you're not just eating junk food, you're eating lots of legumes, nuts and seeds, and even whole grains can be a reasonable source of iron. Then you want to be consuming enough vitamin C rich foods. And so we're thinking about, these organic acids, including vitamin C, that actually can enhance the absorption of non-heme iron by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. And so when you're eating a meal that's rich in legumes, you want to have some red peppers there, or some broccoli, or some other foods that will help to increase the absorption of that iron.
Now, what about pregnancy and breastfeeding on a plant-based diet?
Pregnancy, you really do have higher requirements for many nutrients. And so you need to be a little more diligent about eating your legumes and tofu and those kinds of foods that are more concentrated sources of protein. You have to be absolutely certain you have a reliable source of B12 and vitamin D, and you want to make sure you're getting enough iron. And generally, you're going to be taking a prenatal supplement, which will include that. And then you may continue to use that during breastfeeding as well. One of the surefire ways of excreting toxins from your body is to breastfeed. You give them to your baby. And so, but when you're on a plant-based diet, you're consuming foods lower on the food chain, so your levels in breast milk are a fraction of what they are in meat eaters. So that gives you a huge advantage when you're breastfeeding your child.
Breast milk is so nutrient dense, right? And for someone listening who may not be able to breastfeed, what are the options? Like, what are the options?
The breast milk of human beings will always be better for human babies than the milk of anything else. So if you can't use your own, using someone else's would be the next best option. Then, barring that, if you're vegan and you don't want to use the milk of any other species, like a cow or a goat or whatever, then you're going to be looking at plant-based milks. And the one cardinal rule is never, ever make your own infant formula. This is a formula for disaster, and the children we've seen die and become, grossly malnourished, who are born to vegan parents, are vegan parents who make their own formula and don't know what they're doing. If you're not able to breastfeed and not able to use human milk for your infant, then what you would need to use is a commercial infant formula.
Now, for someone listening who might want to add more plants into their diet, where can they start?
I would just start very simply. I mean, even if you're, eating meat and poultry and fish and all of those things, just start by adding more plants. So trying to increase your intake of vegetables by 1 or 2 extra vegetables a day, by making sure every single meal you eat contains fruits and vegetables. And then start looking at, adding 1 serving of legumes a day. At some point, it could just be hummus with veggies for veggies and dip at the beginning. And then, adding a few legumes to a salad, putting a few chickpeas on your salad, adding some legumes into a soup or stew, and start slowly that way. And what you'll find eventually is that these healthy plant foods start to crowd out the other foods. So it just depends on the individual, but there are ways of sneaking these things in so you barely even notice them. Yeah.
But something that really did kind of get me on my path was I watched a lot of documentaries. I watched Forks Over Knives, Cowspiracy, Hungry for Change, Food Matters, Earthlings. There's all these amazing documentaries that can really help educate yourself, because what I want to do is I want to present all of the information to everyone listening. I want to present, everything. And then you make the best decision for you. Because if you don't know, you don't know. But once you then have the knowledge and the information, then you can make the best and the truest decision for you. So please educate yourselves by watching these documentaries. And if there's one thing that you can watch that really hit home for me, it's called The Best Speech Ever. It is I think it's about an hour and a bit. It is not called The Best Speech Ever for no reason. It is so powerful. And I really want to encourage everybody to just get the information, and then you can make the best decision for you. No judgment. There's no judgment here. It's just, I want everybody to have all of the information so that they know. That's, something that I feel really passionate about.